You're listening to Elder Myths and Shadows, where forgotten tales breathe again.
They never scream. They never lunge. They simply knock. And then they ask, in a voice too calm, too old for their small faces, if they can come in. For 30 years, people across the world have described the same encounter. Children standing in the dark with eyes that are not eyes at all, but two pools of solid black. This is the story of the black-eyed children, how a single strange night in a Texas parking lot in 1996 gave birth to one of the internet's first true monsters, and why, decades later, people are still afraid to answer the door. Before we get to the case that started it all, let's define exactly what we're dealing with. Black-eyed children, often shortened to BEK, are described as looking almost entirely human. Children or teenagers, usually between 6 and 16 years old, with pale, sometimes sickly skin, dressed in plain or old-fashioned clothing that often looks slightly wrong, as if it doesn't quite fit. And then there are the eyes. No white, no color, no pupil, just black, edge to edge, like something has been poured into the sockets. They're reported hitchhiking on empty roads, begging outside gas stations, standing at car windows late at night. But most often, they're described on doorsteps, knocking politely, asking for something small. A ride, a phone call, permission to come inside and wait for their parents. And according to nearly every account, there's one rule that never breaks. They cannot come in unless you say yes. The story begins with a real person, Brian Bethel, a journalist working the late shift at a newspaper in Abilene, Texas. In January of 1996, he pulled into a parking lot near a movie theater to write a check for a bill. It was an unremarkable errand on an unremarkable night, the kind of task that takes 90 seconds and is forgotten by morning. This night would not be forgotten. As he sat in his car, pen in hand, Bethel felt the hair rise on the back of his neck, a sudden, inexplicable unease with no clear cause. Moments later, two boys appeared beside his window, seemingly from nowhere. They looked like ordinary kids, maybe 10 and 14 years old. Polite, well-spoken, too well-spoken, in a way that felt rehearsed rather than natural. They asked for a ride to their mother's house, just a few minutes away, so they could get money for the movie. It sounded reasonable enough, until Bethel glanced at the marquee behind them. The film they claimed they wanted to see had already started, 45 minutes ago. There was no way they'd make it in time, and somehow, they didn't seem to care. Then Bethel looked at their eyes. Later, he'd struggled to describe exactly what he saw. Not just dark irises, but a total absence of anything human. No white, no color. Just two flat, black voids that seemed to swallow the marquee light instead of reflecting it. A wave of dread hit him so hard it felt physical. A fear with no logical source, as if his body understood the danger before his mind could catch up. The older boy grew impatient. His tone shifted, still calm but colder, more insistent. He told Bethel that he and his brother couldn't get into the car unless Bethel told them it was okay. It seems like a strange thing to say. Why would two children need permission to open a car door? But it's a detail that would appear again and again in later accounts, as if permission, an invitation, was the one thing standing between them and whatever came next. Bethel didn't wait to find out. He threw the car into reverse and sped out of the lot. When he checked his mirror seconds later, the boys were simply gone. Not walking away, not running. Gone, as though the parking lot had never held them at all. 2 years later, in 1998, Bethel finally wrote the encounter down and posted it to an online mailing list dedicated to ghost stories. In that same post, he included a second, unrelated account from an acquaintance in Portland, Oregon, a man named John Northwood, who described an almost identical experience. A late night, a group of kids on a street corner, and eyes that shouldn't have existed. Northwood had been leaving a late evening seminar in downtown Portland when he spotted a small group of kids gathered on a corner. As he approached, the same pattern unfolded. A request, a growing unease, and finally, the eyes. Two separate men, two separate cities, telling nearly the same story, years apart, with no apparent connection to each other. That coincidence, or pattern, is part of what made the story spread. Bethel's post didn't disappear into the internet's early noise. It spread. Ghost forums, mailing lists, and eventually websites picked it up. He published a follow-up FAQ just to keep up with the demand for more information. The story became one of the first true pieces of what we'd now call creepypasta. Internet-native horror, born and raised entirely online, spreading faster than any campfire tale ever could.
As the story spread, so did the details, and a template began to form. Nearly every account that followed shared the same core traits. Children, aged roughly 6 to 16, pale to the point of looking unwell, dressed in clothing that seemed just slightly off, as though borrowed or handmade. Monotone voices, a strange formality in how they spoke, more suited to adults than kids. And of course, the eyes. Total edge-to-edge black. No visible white, no iris. It's the single detail every account agrees on. The one image that made the legend so instantly shareable. Because everyone understands, on some primal level, exactly why that would be terrifying. The most consistent and most chilling behavioral detail is the invitation rule. In story after story, the children never simply walk in, force a door, or climb through a window. They wait. They ask. And if refused, they may grow frustrated, repeat the request, even attempt something like grief or pleading, but they don't cross the threshold uninvited. If that rule sounds familiar, it should. It's the same rule that governs vampires in centuries of folklore. Creatures barred from crossing a threshold unless a resident grants them permission. Some researchers believe the black-eyed children legend didn't invent this idea. It borrowed it, consciously or not, from a much older well of storytelling about doors, invitations, and the danger of saying yes. Beyond the eyes and the invitation rule, secondary details started showing up in report after report. Witnesses describe a strange, sourceless odor around the children, sometimes sweet, sometimes rotten. Electronics glitching nearby, phones losing signal, car radios filling with static, streetlights flickering as the children approach. Whether these are genuine patterns or details absorbed from other paranormal folklore is impossible to say for certain. In 2012, paranormal researcher David Weatherly set out to answer a deeper question. Did this phenomenon really begin with Brian Bethel in 1996? Or had people been describing something similar long before the internet existed to spread it? His research, compiled into a full-length book on the subject, dug through decades of old accounts, deliberately avoiding modern terms like BEK, so he wouldn't just find stories shaped by Bethel's own account. The earliest account Weatherly uncovered dated to the 1950s, decades before Abilene. A teenage boy named Harold, out walking alone on a country road, encountered a strange, distant child who insisted Harold walk him home. Harold spoke with the boy for some time in broad daylight before an inexplicable dread set in, and he fled on foot. What makes Harold's account interesting isn't just its age, it's how it differs from the modern template. There was no instant, overwhelming panic, no mention of solid black eyes. The dread built slowly, over minutes of ordinary conversation, before Harold understood something was deeply wrong. At the time, his own parents reportedly believed the boy he'd met was something demonic. Weatherly also traced an account from 1974 in the Ain region of France, though this one veers into stranger territory. Two men driving through a small village reportedly spotted 5 short figures in a courtyard, dressed alike in long, spotted garments. Their skin was described as an unnatural yellowish tone, and their eyes, enormous, solid black, the size of billiard balls. This case sits at an odd crossroads, filed originally as a UFO encounter rather than a ghost story, and featuring beings that sound more alien than childlike. Whether it belongs in the same category as Bethel's boys or Harold's country road stranger is genuinely debated. But the recurring detail, those vast, solid black eyes, kept drawing researchers back to it. Weatherly claims to have traced echoes of the black-eyed motif even further back, into old accounts from China describing a ghostly figure with solid black eyes. Whether these represent a genuinely continuous tradition or simply humanity's tendency to reach for the same handful of frightening images again and again is, like most of this legend, unresolved. Not everyone is convinced any of this reflects something real. Science writer Sharon Hill spent time trying to track down verifiable, documented black-eyed children encounters, and came up empty. Her conclusion? These are classic friend of a friend stories, the same structural pattern found in folklore about phantom black dogs and other spectral roadside encounters. Stories that spread not because they're true, but because they're built to travel. That's the nature of FOAF folklore. Friend of a friend stories. Nobody making the claim actually experienced it themselves. It always happened to someone they know, or someone that person knows. It's a structure that makes a story nearly impossible to verify, and nearly impossible to fully debunk at the same time. Which is exactly why legends like this one can survive for decades without a shred of hard evidence. Skeptics also point to plausible, entirely human explanations. Certain rare eye conditions, like mydriasis, extreme pupil dilation, or aniridia, the absence of an iris, can make eyes appear almost entirely dark, especially in poor lighting. Add adrenaline, stress, and a dimly lit parking lot at night, and human perception can distort in genuinely convincing ways. Then there's the simplest explanation of all. Costume-grade black sclera contact lenses, worn as part of a prank, a dare, or even an early piece of viral content, long before anyone called anything viral. In an era before smartphone cameras were everywhere, a convincing lens and a good performance could easily become an unforgettable and unverifiable story. But not every account ends with the witness driving away. Buried in Weatherly's research is one especially unsettling case. A woman whose own 10-year-old son opened the door and, against every instinct the legend warns about, let a black-eyed child inside. What followed, according to the account, was not immediate horror, but a slow unraveling. An accident in the household. Then a long, unexplained illness that took months to resolve. Everyone involved eventually recovered. But the case stands out because it's one of the only documented instances where someone claims to have broken the one rule every other story insists you never break. By the 2000s, the legend had crossed the Atlantic. In September of 2014, the British tabloid The Daily Star ran 3 separate front-page stories in a single week about alleged black-eyed children sightings connected to a supposedly haunted pub. Whatever the truth behind those specific claims, the coverage introduced the legend to an entirely new audience, and black-eyed children sightings began surfacing across the UK, Canada, and Australia. So why children? Why not the classic shadow figure, or the pale stranger, or the man in black? Because children are supposed to be safe. Evolution has wired us to protect them almost instinctively, to lower our guard, to open the door. The black-eyed children legend takes that instinct and turns it into a weapon. It doesn't ask you to fear a monster. It asks you to distrust your own compassion. That's part of why theories about what these beings actually are tend to split into a few recurring camps. The most popular explanation among believers is that they're some form of alien or alien hybrid entity. Beings that resemble children specifically because it lowers our defenses long enough to get what they want. The second most common theory leans religious rather than extraterrestrial. That these are demonic entities, testing whether they'll be willingly led across a spiritual threshold. It's telling that a number of people who report encounters say the experience pushed them toward religious practice afterward, reciting prayers, seeking protection, treating the encounter as a spiritual near miss rather than a simple scare. Weatherly's research deliberately avoided settling on one answer. His book moves through alien hybrids, hungry ghosts, succubi-adjacent entities, elaborate teenage pranks, and genuine demonic encounters, testing each theory against the accounts rather than forcing the accounts to fit a single conclusion. It's a rare example of paranormal research trying to hold multiple possibilities at once, instead of chasing the most dramatic one. And Brian Bethel himself? Decades later, he still lives in Abilene. He's retold the story publicly more than once, including on a paranormal reality series in 2012, and has never walked it back. When asked what would have happened if he'd said yes that night, he's been characteristically blunt. He believes he wouldn't be around to tell the story at all. What started as one man's mailing list post exploded into a full-blown piece of modern folklore. Books, documentaries, indie horror films, and flash games built entirely around outrunning them. Podcast episodes retelling the Abilene encounter to new audiences every year. The black-eyed children didn't just survive the transition from 1990s internet forums to the modern era. They thrived in it. And the sightings haven't stopped. Accounts continue to surface well into the 2020s. Posted to forums, shared on social media, retold on paranormal podcasts by people who insist they've never heard of the legend before their own encounter happened. Whether that's proof of something real or proof of just how deeply the template has embedded itself in our collective imagination depends entirely on who you ask. Maybe that's the real reason this story refuses to die. It isn't about proving black-eyed children are real. It's about the moment right before you'd find out. The knock at the door, the tap on the window, the split second where you have to decide whether to open up. Every one of us has stood at that threshold in our imagination, and every one of us, if we're honest, isn't entirely sure what we'd do. There is no photograph, no physical evidence, no confirmed case that survives serious scrutiny. And yet, in an age of doorbell cameras and constant surveillance, new accounts keep appearing. Children with eyes like poured ink, standing patiently in the dark, waiting for someone, somewhere, to finally say yes. So if you're home alone tonight and you hear a knock that comes a little too late, a little too calm, take a moment before you answer. Look through the peephole first. And if you see a small, pale face staring back, with eyes that swallow the porch light whole, maybe just don't say, "It's okay." Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe. Comment what topic you'd like to see next. Another whisper awaits, if you dare.